Hi everyone, myself Harshita S. I'm currently pursuing my 6th SEM in Sri Venkateshwara College of Engineering. My today's topic is all about the web technology and its applications. In that, we are studying very important topic, that is the creation of tables and creation of forms. So, how do we create the tables? So, a table in HTML is created using the HTML table element, and it can be used to represent the information that exists in a two-dimensional grid. The tables can be used to display calendars, financial data, pricing tables, and many other types of data. So we'll look at what is the basic table structure. An HTML table will contain any number of rows that is denoted by TR, and each row contains any number of table data cells that is TD. So the data cells will be denoted by the tag TD and the row cells will be denoted by the tag TR. So here is a basic table structure of how table is created using TR and TD. So the table will start with the table tag and the row will start with the row tag, and the TD will contain the information that can fit into the data cells. That is the date of the marriage, the Jacques Louis David, and 1973 and 62 centimeter and 122 centimeter. All these are the data that are fitting into this particular data cells inside the row. So this is a brief description of how the table is being created using the table, and the TR is the row and TH is nothing but it is replaced instead of TD, and we can fit the number of data cells as needed. So this is nothing but adding table headings. So it is given as follows. So it starts with the table and it will start with the TR, and the TH will be started with the title and it will terminate in the same line itself. So spanning rows and columns. So we have learned two key things about the tables. The first thing is that all the content must appear within the TD or TH container. And the second is that each row must have the same number of TD and TH containers. So there is no way to change the second behavior. If you want a given cell to cover several columns or rows, then you need to do using the row span and column span attributes. So we'll check how we can execute within this row span and column span attributes. As in the table we have declared. So it starts with the table, and these are the rows that we have given with the TR, and TH we have given. And in order to include include the column span and extra column, we will have to use this formula, that is size of width into height. So we're using that, we can actually include another column that is using the column span. So using the column span and row span, we can include the extra rows and columns. So this is the basic table structure of how we can include an extra columns and rows. Next, the creation of forms. An HTML form is used to collect user input, and the user input is most often sent to a server for processing. So it is given by the form tag, and you can fill the form elements here, and it is terminated using the form. Next is your input element. So the HTML input element is most often used form element. An input element can be used in many ways, that is depending upon the type attribute. Here are some of those examples. That is, input type is text. It is used to display in single line text input field. Input type is radio. It is used to display in radio button. Input type is checkbox. It is used to display in checkbox, that is for selecting zero or more number of choices. And input type is submit. That is used to display in submit button for submitting the form. And input type is equals to button. It is this to display in clickable button. We'll study all these in brief by using the W3 schools. So now we'll study about the HTML forms more by using the W3 schools. So here we have to go for the W3 schools online web tutorials. And here we have learn HTML. So here, when we come brief down, we have the HTML. We have the HTML forms here. So we'll click on the HTML forms. So these are the basic HTML forms that have been displayed here. So first, What is an HTML form in brief? It is used to collect the user input, and the user input is most often used to send a server for processing. So here are some of the examples that we can try it ourselves in order to understand very clearly. So here I'm giving the first name as Ranbir. And the second name, the last name is Kabur. So when I submit it, so my request as submitted for the input will be first name will be Ranbir and last name will be Kabur. So this is the default HTML structure that will start with the doc type HTML, then the HTML and the body and the HTML forms. This is a basic title. So after submitting the title, we're going to terminate it with the same body and then the HTML. Next, the form elements. So the HTML form element that is used to create an HTML for the user input. So this is in the form of this. So the form element is a container that contains a different type of input elements such as text field, checkboxes, and radio buttons, submit buttons, etc. So next, what is the input element? So the input element is the most often used an element, and it is used for displaying in many ways depending upon the type attribute. So here are some of the examples. So input type text will display a single line text, and these are all discussed in the previous slide. So the text fields, so the input text is equals to input type is equal to text is used to define a single line input field for text input. The label element, so the input label element, the label tag will define a label for many of the form elements. So the label element is used for screen reader users because the screen reader will read out the label when the user focuses on the input element. The label element will also help the user who have difficulty on clicking many small regions such as radio boxes and buttons. Because the user clicks the text within the label element, it toggles the radio text box or checkbox. So the radio buttons. So we'll see what is this radio buttons. So the radio buttons, the input radio button is used to define the radio. So the radio button let a user to select one or more limited number of choices. Next is our checkboxes. So languages, you can choose what is your favorite language. So when we give HTML, so it will display in the particular HTML. Next is our checkboxes. So the input type is equal to checkbox that defines a particular checkbox, and checkbox will let a user to select 1, 0 or more options of a limited number of choices. Next is the submit button. So basically, as the name only tells, submit button is used to submit. So the input type is equal to submit will define a button for submitting the form data to a form handler. The form handler is typically a file on the server with a script for processing the input data. So next one is the name attribute. So the name attribute is same. If the name attribute is omitted, the value of the input field will not be sent at all. So this is the name attribute. We can try all of this by using the exercises here. So this HTML exercises, we can try and learn them in brief. Next is the HTML form attributes. So in this chapter, we'll describe the different attributes for the HTML form attribute. So first is nothing but the action attribute. So the action attribute defines the action to be performed when the form will be submitted. Usually the form data is sent to a file on the server when the user clicks on the submit button. In this example below, the form data is sent to a file called action_page.php, and this file contains a server-side script that handles the form data. So here we'll try this. So whatever we save the data, it will be saved under the action_page. So that is the form action. So giving the first name as Ranbir, the last name is Kapoor. So when I submit it, the data will be saved in the action_page in the form of F name and L name. Next is the target attribute. So the target attribute is nothing but it specifies where to display the response that is received after submitting the form. So we have few of the target attributes, the values for it, and what are the description for each of the value. So _blank, this response is displayed in a new window tab. Say _self is used to display in the current window. _parent, it is used to display in the parent frame. And the _top, it is used to display in the full body of the window. Frame name, it is displayed in the named frame. Next is the method attribute. The method attribute specifies the HTTP method to be used when submitting the form data. So it is in the form of method is equals to get or method is equals to post. Next, the notes that have to be noted when you give on get is appends the form data to the URL in name or value pairs, and never use get to send sensitive data. The length of URL will be limited, that is to 2480 2008 characters, useful for form submissions, and it is used for non-secure data. Next note on post is nothing but the appends the form data inside the body of HTTP request. It has no size limitations, and form submissions with the post cannot be bookmarked. Autocomplete attribute. So the autocomplete attribute specifies whether a form should have autocomplete on or off. If it is on, then the browser automatically will complete the values. If it is off, it doesn't do that. Next, the non-validate attribute. So the non-validate attribute is a Boolean attribute. When present, it specifies that the form data should not be validated when it is submitted. So with these exercises, you can briefly know how all these HTML forms will be saved within the action_page.php. Next is our HTML form elements. So here we'll study about how different HTML form elements work. So what are the different HTML form elements is nothing but the input, label, select, text area, button, legend, the data list, the output, the option, and then opt group. So in this, we'll first study what is the input element. One of the most used form element is the input element, and this input element can be displayed in several ways depending upon the type attribute. That is nothing but, with this example, we'll see how it works. So same thing, I'll give the first name, and when I submit it, it will be the first name, it will be processed, and it will be saved under this input element that is starting with H2 and ending with the H2 tag. Next, the label element. The label element defines a label for several form elements, and the label element is useful for screen reader users because the screen reader will read out loud the label when the user focuses on the input element. And the label element also help the users who have difficulty clicking on very small regions, because when the user clicks the text within the label element, it toggles the radio button checkbox. The for attribute of the label tag should be equal to the ID attribute of the input element to bind them together. Next is the select element. The select element defines a drop-down list. That is, the option element will define an option that can be selected. By default, the first item in the drop-down list is selected to define a pre-selected option at the selected attribute to be option. Next is the visible values. Use the size attribute to specify the number of visible values and allow the multiple selections. Use the multiple attribute to allow the user to select more than one value. Next is the text area element. The text area element will define a multi-line input field. So the row attribute will specify the visible number of lines in a text area. The column attribute will specify the visible width of a text area. This is how the HTML code will work. By using that, you can see. Next, the button element. The button element defines a clickable button. Next is the field set and legend elements. The field set element is used to group related data in form. Legend element defines a caption for the field set element. The data list element. The data list element specifies a list of predefined options for an input element. Users will see a drop-down list of predefined options as they input data. The list attribute of the input element must refer to an ID attribute of the data list element. The output element. The output element represents the result of calculation. So next is our HTML input types. So the input types are also same as described. So first input type is our input text. So it will define a single line text input field. Our input type password, it is used to define a password field. So your username and password will be displayed here. Next, we have our input type submit. This is used for submitting the form data to a form handler. And the form handler is typically a server page with a script for processing the input data. Next is our input type reset. So it is used to reset the button that is used to reset their values to the default values. Next is the input type radio. That is used to define a radio button that is used to select only one or a limited number of choices. Checkbox, it is used to select 0 or more options of a limited number of choices. So here we have our color. So color is input type color is nothing but depending upon the browser support, a color picker can show up into the input field. Next, the date. So the date is used for the input fields that should contain a date. Depending upon the browser support, a data picker can show up in the input field. Next is the input type, date type, local. So here it is nothing but The input type, a date-time local, specifies a date and time input field with no time zone. Depending on the browser support, a date picker can show up in the input field. And input type email is used for input fields that should contain an email address. Depending on the browser support, the email address can automatically be validated when it is submitted. Next, image. Input type image is nothing but it is used to define an image as a submit button, and this path will show in the form of src attribute, that is nothing but the source attribute. Next, we'll see what are the input attributes in HTML. So the attributes are nothing but the value attribute that specifies an initial value for an input attribute. That is nothing but so here the input attribute will be in this form. Next is the read-only attribute. The read-only attribute specifies that an input field is read-only, and a read-only input field cannot be modified. The value of a read-only input field will be sent when only submitting the form. The disabled attribute will specify that an input field should be disabled, and this disabled input field is unusable and unclickable. The size attribute. The input size attribute should be, the default size is 20, and it is used to specify the visible width in characters of an input field. It is used only for the input types such as text, search, tell, URL, email, and password. The max length attribute. It is used to specify the maximum number of characters that is allowed within the input field. The minimum and maximum attributes also specify the minimum and maximum values for an input field that are used only for number, range, date, time, local, month, time, and week. The multiple attribute specifies that a user is allowed to enter more number of one value in an input field, and the multiple attribute works on following types, that is email and file. The pattern attribute specifies a regular expression that the input field value is checked against when form is submitted. It is used in text, date, search, URL, tell, email, and password. Next, the combined form is in HTML input form into attributes. So here again we are studying about the form attribute, that is the value of this attribute must be equal to the ID attribute of the form element that it will belong to. So the attribute and the form should both be equal. So when I give Ranveer and submit, that will also be same. And when I give in the attribute also will be same. Next, the form action attribute. The form action attribute, the input form action attribute specifies the URL of the file that will process the input when the form is submitted. The form CType attribute. So the input form CType attribute will specify how the form data should be encoded when it is submitted. Next, the form method attribute. The method input form method attribute will define the HTTP method for sending the form data into the action URL. Next, the form validate attribute. So the form validate attribute the form non-validate attribute. So the form non-validate attribute will specify that an input element should not be validated when it is submitted. And when it comes to form validate attribute, it will specify that the input element should be validated when it should be submitted. And the form target attribute will specify a name or a keyboard that indicates where to display the response that is received after submitting the particular form. I hope you all understood the topic, and thank you.